What's up, everybody? I'm Billy Ryan, and you are listening to the No One Is Watching podcast, where we explore leadership, culture, and the impact they have on high-performing teams. We can all admire the championships that are won on the field and the big profits that show up on the balance sheet. But this show is dedicated to the premise that those battles are won long before they start. Through conversations with elite performers and leaders in the world of business, sports, and life in general, we'll learn valuable lessons on how you can optimize yourself and your organization. Today, I'm joined by Josh Rawitch, president of the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Josh talks about his transition from idolizing Steve Sax as a kid to MLB PR man to custodian over baseball immortality. We discuss the unique challenges that come with leading a nonprofit organization and a museum and what it's like sharing that Rockwellian experience of living in Cooperstown with his family. Well, Josh, good to see you, man. Thanks for taking the time this morning.
It is a pleasure and an honor. Excited to catch up.
Yeah, man. So do you, tell me, do you walk to work or do you drive?
Depends on the time of year. I live about 2 blocks from the hall, and I drop my kids at school, which was not something I used to be able to do in my old life. So if I'm driving them, it's a driving day. But if it's summertime, I'm usually walking, and it's very easy. It's about a 4 or 5 minute walk from the front door of the hall to the front door of my house.
So you wake up, I imagine you like lace up your Jackie Robinson cleats, you pick up Babe Ruth's bat and like use that as the walking stick, right? Is that how it goes in Cooperstown?
That'd be nice, man. I wish I could do that good stuff. We try to take care of those things when these guys give it to us. So I guess unfortunately going to have to save those walking sticks for another day.
Yeah, man, I hear you. It's got to be. You grew up in California, right? You're a West Coast guy.
Yeah,
Los Angeles. Spent time in LA. We crossed paths in Arizona, so used to the heat and the sunshine. And now you're, although I'm sure it's beautiful there right now, living through some harsher winters up in Cooperstown. But
yeah,
it's got to be. It's just got to be a surreal experience, man. I mean, you grew up a baseball nerd like I did, and just can kind of geek out with the best of them on the history of the game, and started sort of your career in baseball in the communications world, you know, and now here you are in charge of like the crown jewel of the entire sport.
Yeah, it's pretty nuts. I mean, there's really not a whole lot of people, I think, that would ever imagine, hey, I think I might end up in Cooperstown. I mean, even the greatest players don't dare to dream
Right,
like I'm going to end up in Cooperstown. And so I think on the team side, those of us who've worked at teams, it's not a place you necessarily think of as, oh, you know what, maybe someday if a job opened up there. And it wasn't a place I was looking for it. It found me. And yet it is without a doubt, as you said, like every day I'm kind of in awe of something going on around me. As somebody who grew up loving the game since age 5 and then working in it for 27 years to end up here. And yeah, the winters are chilly. That's fine. It is the exact opposite of Arizona. And in fact, today, as we're recording, it is 72 and sunny and absolute perfection. So we should have about 6 months of greatness here. And we've actually adjusted to the winters the same way we had to adjust to the summers in Arizona. It's not that bad. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've been lucky enough to get there a couple times, not in the winter. It's been in the summer, but yeah, I mean, look, it is, we've talked about it. It's like out of a Rockwell painting, and it's got this just picturesque, almost time machine quality. And I imagine even with the foot of snow on the ground, it's still pretty, and it's still something you can appreciate. Cause it does. I mean, with the world being the way it is today, everything digital and sort of virtual, it feels like you're kind of going back in time a little bit and having a different lived experience when you're in Cooperstown.
That's exactly it. It does. It is in some ways Rockwellian. I mean, my wife and I at one point were walking back from dinner on Main Street, and she's like, I feel like we're on a movie set. Like, this doesn't even feel real. And I'm like, I keep waiting for the director to be like, cut, scene's over.
The Truman Show, right? Yeah.
And it obviously isn't happening. But it is. What's interesting is that in the winter, it's not like even with the snow, it's beautiful. It's because of the snow, it's beautiful. I mean, there are so many good. The fall here is incredible. And even we had somebody from MLB Network drive up here last week, and he said, you know, I always thought driving up here in the fall would be gorgeous, but driving up in the spring is incredible. Like, man, everything's so green. And when you spend a decade in the desert, which my wife lovingly called the land of beige, you just get this incredible feeling that you're surrounded by nature and by animals and farmland, and then you've got this little village, this picturesque village that is just an incredible place to call home.
Yeah. So you actually mentioned something earlier that I wanted to touch on, is like your point about players don't even, like, nobody they get their big league debut. They're saying someday I'm going to be inducted in Cooperstown, right? Like
Yeah.
nobody thinks like that. It's just too hard. The odds are stacked against you. And I mean, it's to a lesser extent, it's like that working in the game, just trying to get a job in the game and working for a club or the league or wherever you are. And I had that exact point as I was thinking about this. It was like, no one ever thinks, yeah, I want to work in Cooperstown someday, right? Like it's just so far out there and it's so far off the path of anything sort of realistic that you're sitting there today has to feel like a little bit of serendipity, that it just kind of happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I was just telling somebody a couple of days ago. Somebody said, "How did I get to know my predecessor, Jeff Idelson, so well?" I said, "Honestly, I was at the Diamondbacks. I had we went to the Dominican for Luis Gonzalez's induction into the Latin Baseball Hall of Fame, and I randomly wound up in a foursome with Jeff Idelson, Kim Ang, who's now obviously the GM of the Marlins and a good friend of mine from the Dodgers, and John Blundell at Major League Baseball. And it was really only because of that round that I spent the day with Idelson. And when he decided he was leaving, he thought, you know what, I think Josh might be a good fit for this. And he called. And I think so. I mean, at the moment that he called, I was actually pulling into Salt River Fields. It was early in the morning during spring training. And I just remember thinking, thanks, but I'm not moving to Cooperstown. Like, there's just no way. And I thought, I ought to at least hear this guy out. And so I did. And I said, all right, well, let me give you a call back. And I came home and mentioned it to my wife. And she's like, how would you ever turn that down if you had that opportunity? And it was like this, like, you know? And so I think that is one of the challenges we have here is getting people to think about this as a place where they might want to work, because it is an incredible place to work. It's an incredible place to live, and there's amazing things about it. Just like anywhere in the world, it's got its challenges and unique aspects to it, but we've really fit into life here great, and we love it. And I hope more people from around the game look at this as a place they might someday go to work.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you started in sort of in the communications and PR world, right? Is that where you always saw yourself as a kid, as a baseball fan? What would you want to be when you grow up?
I wanted to be Steve Sachs. I saw myself more as a second baseman, but yeah, the all field no hit label got.
Well, then you got to work with Saxy for a little bit in Arizona.
Yes, in fact, actually, it's pretty funny. When we hired him, when Gibby hired him, he had just about 2 weeks before that sent me a note on LinkedIn saying, "I'm thinking about getting back into the game." And I thought, what a weird world am I in that this dude that I used to sprint to first base on my walks because that's what he did.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, I mean, it's pretty
That's
amazing.
funny.
And he was actually here last year as part of the Hall of Fame Classic we do every Memorial Day weekend. He was the Dodgers rep. And so just life comes full circle a million ways. But yeah, I went to college thinking I wanted to be a broadcaster. Don't know if you grew up listening to Vin Scully, and I figured, okay, well, that's what you do. I don't even think I knew front offices other than the GM were a thing.
Right.
And then ultimately landed an internship with the Dodgers after my freshman year of college, which was just dumb luck. Back in the day, it was not nearly as competitive as it is now. And then pretty much within 10 days of being in their office, I thought, I think this is actually what I want to do, be on the front office side. And for a long time, I thought I wanted to be on baseball ops. Eventually kind of shifted more towards business ops and actually started out in marketing before moving over to PR and making my way up the rungs.
Cool. That's cool. So, I spent a lot of time thinking and talking about sort of human performance and how these people that are, whether it's in sports or elsewhere, just the best of the best and how they do it, how they maintain it. Right. And you are swimming in that night. You just literally walk through a living museum of the greatest who have ever done that in baseball. And so I'm curious, what have you just absorbed just by literally just like osmosis, just being there? Has anything just stood out to you?
One thing is definitely humility. I do think that there's something, even when you're the best in the world at what you do, there's something about these guys that once they make it into this exclusive club of the top 1%, even if there was arrogance and cockiness and all that when they were playing, they get into this room on Sunday night of induction. I'm ridiculously blessed to be in this dinner that is just the living Hall of Famers, the commissioner of baseball, myself. And you look around and it's these guys, every one of them has a humility to them that like they appreciate where they are. They recognize fellow greatness, and there's not an arrogance or a cockiness to it that I think is one thing that's jumped out at me. And then honestly, something I've always just believed in work ethic, particularly as these guys, they worked so hard to get to where they are. You can be blessed with all the talent in the world, but you really have to outwork the people around you, and even that doesn't guarantee your success. But there's nobody with a plaque on the wall who didn't work insanely hard, make major sacrifices, whether it was in the family life or in the other things they wanted to do with their lives, to be able to get that plaque in the gallery. And it's crazy. Literally, as you think of the 23,000 people who ever played, and to only have basically 1% of them actually reach that point, it's a level of dedication that very few people can really understand.
Yeah, yeah, there's no doubt. And I mean, we would always sort of play that the attrition game of I mean, just getting to pro ball, right? Getting to double A, getting a cup of coffee. I mean, there's just so many hurdles. And to your point, like what I was drawn to, particularly like the latter half of my career in the front office, was the or I shouldn't say non-tangible, but less tangible, right? Everybody can see the physical gifts. Everybody can see like kind of the work ethic, but these other things that are just harder to pinpoint, like the makeup, right? We always talked about in baseball, it's like the makeup, what drives these people. And it's always been a separator. It's like there are guys that the talent maybe justifies them being AAA, right? But they eke out a 7-year big league career because they're just wired the right way. And that's also, in my opinion, what separates the really good ones from the great ones, and it doesn't always look the same, right? Like some guys can be brash and cocky when they're playing, and others can be super humble and soft spoken, but they have some semblance of the same gene in there that's just gonna not let them continue to succeed and squeeze every like ounce of ability they have out of their bodies.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. People in baseball talk about this a lot because of the kind of age old, you fail 7 times out of 10 and you're a Hall of Famer sort of approach to batting average. But there is a skill set that some humans have that allow them to fail and keep going back out there over and over. And it was, not to equate this, but yesterday as I sat at my son's game, I was talking to one of the other dads, and my son was pitching, and he was struggling. And generally, he's a pretty good pitcher, but he was struggling. And he's like, you know what? He had a bad inning last inning, but look at him. He's back out there right now, and he's doing well. He's like, my kid doesn't do that. Like, I think he would struggle with that if that was him. And I thought to myself, that's what makes big leaguers. Like they stink one day and they find a way to get back out there the next, and that is not an easy thing to do. And I don't even know that you can teach it. I mean, you can certainly try to tell somebody, hey, you got knocked down, get back up. A lot of people have a lot of horrible things happen to them in life, and they somehow turn it back around. And these inspirational stories of like, I couldn't get up in the morning if that happened to me. And these people do. And I think if you're a big leaguer, and certainly if you're a Hall of Famer, you've got an ability to just file away what happened yesterday and
we talk about that in sports all the time, right? Like when you're talking about defensive back in football, right? The short memory. I talked to Bob McKillop, who coached Steph Curry in college, and he was talking about that with Steph, just the ability to not just flush the past, but stay in the moment and even have kind of like a little bit of a half step eye toward what's like predicting the future, right? And so that's like the truly great ones can do that. But yeah, I mean, baseball, it's the game of failure sort of talking points, and the good ones or the great ones, right? They're able to not just flush the moment, but like kind of take something away from it. Like, okay, I learn a little tiny bit. And you're like, what's a guy learning from a strikeout? He's been in the big leagues for 10 years. How many times has he been, up? Yeah. But the good ones find a way to do it. And it's just, that's what I really geek out on, is watching these guys. And some of them, honestly, they're just freaks. And I don't even know if they realize that they're doing it, right? It's so like self-conscious, and they're so good at it that it's almost, you get in that flow state and you're seeing through the matrix and you're picking stuff up, right? Yeah. But they all do it. I'm convinced that they all do it. And I'm just, I can't imagine some of the conversations that go on during that dinner. And you got to have like Ken Griffey Jr. sitting there who's got his childhood heroes like sitting at the table. So he's probably like, talk about the humility and the awe that you have. Yeah. Like, it's got to be incredible.
Yeah, that's what's really cool, is that these guys are all sitting with their own heroes. And there's always been, I think it's Johnny Bench now, who's kind of taken on this father figure role, where he'll take the new guys, and when they're sitting on the veranda at the Otasaga Hotel, bring them up to the rocking chair, sit them down, and say, like, you're part of this club now. Take a look at where you are. And it just, if you grew up idolizing Johnny Bench, or whoever is going to be the one that idolized Ken Griffey Jr. that gets inducted, it's crazy to think that these people are actually where they've reached. It just doesn't seem like a like a thing that could happen, and yet for a very, very select few it does, and I'm honored to just get to watch it happen as a fly on the wall.
Yeah, yeah. You talked about your son. Like, what's this been like for you as a dad? I mean, sharing this with your kids. Like, I was always a huge baseball fan as a kid, but I don't know if I really would have appreciated the gravity of it and the history of the game. What are all? I mean, I do now. I love history for that reason. But as a kid, I'm not sure it would have really landed. What's it been like as a dad?
Yeah, it's pretty fast. It's an interesting question. So I would say that for my daughter, who's not a big baseball fan, she actually is working in the gift store here. That's her first job,
Love it.
and so it's been fun to watch her learn about. But she just doesn't know who these guys are. So a lot of times she'll come home and she'll be like, "Hey, I learned today about George Brett or whatever random person." And for my son, who is a massive baseball fan, loves it like none other. When I first told him, when we let him know that we had this job and we were moving to New York, he actually didn't even like believe us. He thought I was kidding. An event like he was so excited about it. But I think he's also he is much more in tune with the modern game, and so he loves that Otani and Trout and whoever else, Goldschmidt, those are the guys he wants to meet. So it wasn't that long ago. There was oh, it was Randy Johnson was actually in town because he's doing an exhibit, a photo exhibit at the museum down the street.
Yeah, I
from the
saw
Hall of
that.
Fame. It's pretty
Great.
amazing, cool thing that Randy's doing. And so I had to swing by the hotel and get him for something. And I asked my son if he wanted to come along, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm good." And I was like, come on, you like. And then when I picked up Randy, and we passed my house on the way back to the hotel, and so I was like, "Oh, hey, that's my house." And Randy's like, "We should go in there and surprise your kid." And I came home and told Braden, and he's like, "I'm probably the only person that's ever turned down the opportunity to see a big leaguer, and then the big leaguer wanted to come and see me." I'm like, "All right, settle down."
Use that moment to humble Randy a little bit. Yeah, like, yeah, my son's not interested.
Exactly. So I mean, it has been awesome for him, but it's funny. I think because he's grown up around the game, it doesn't really like he absolutely gets what's going on and thinks it's really cool, but unfortunately, he meets Fergie Jenkins, and it's like me meeting Babe Ruth. It doesn't really you don't
Yeah, didn't have that
I guess
perspective.
maybe not Babe Ruth, but maybe somebody from the '40s who
Yeah,
I didn't know growing up, and so it's been fun to watch, and I know that he recognizes how lucky he is, and I certainly recognize how lucky we all are.
yeah. He'll look back on it in 20 years and be like, "Oh my god, I can't believe
Yeah,
that was my
absolutely.
life." And even your daughter, like, what was your first job? That'll be a question somebody asks her one day. Like, I
Yeah,
worked in the gift shop at the Hall of Fame.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
that's
it's pretty
awesome.
cool. I've thought about that quite a bit. That when they go to college and people say, "Where'd you grow up?" and they say Cooperstown, it's going to obviously lead to follow up questions. When someone says, "I grew up in Omaha" or "I grew up in Philly," it's like,
Right.
okay, cool. Cooperstown's going to spark some questions from the
Yeah, you
parents.
got to have at least like a working knowledge of baseball
Yes,
when you're growing up
exactly.
in Cooperstown. So have you you get out, you start your career in baseball, and for everybody, I think there's like that wow factor, that novelty. It's just cool being around it, right? It's a very fun, cool, engaging job, very unique experiences you get. Whether you're, in a big league clubhouse or you're on the field or you're interviewing players or whatever it is. But eventually you get numb to that, right? That just becomes work. It becomes life. Have you gotten there yet in Cooperstown?
I have, in a strange way, but not in a. I've promised myself I'll never let this like the cool factor of this wear off. But certainly as it relates to dealing with the Hall of Famers and like that, I think has had to wear off because ultimately I have to deal with them regularly and all the
Yeah.
things that I do. But maybe I'm answering it the wrong way. Certainly, most days I have a calendar reminder on my Outlook that tells me to just go into the museum for a few minutes every day. And I'd say most days I get to it, not as long as I want and not as often as I want, but um, and I will just walk over to a plaque that I haven't read before, or I'll go into something in the museum and learn something I haven't learned. And I'm not sure that'll ever wear off. Like the idea that you're wandering around this place, that people, I mean, you watch people live out lifelong dreams, that you walk behind a family and they're going, the grandfather's crying and I've always wanted to be here. And I'm like, this is my office. And these people are just
Right.
like mind blown to have finally made it here. And there's just so few places on the planet, maybe Mecca and the Taj Mahal, and like that people want to make a pilgrimage to.
Yeah.
People literally plan a pilgrimage to this place and then execute it every day for 362 days a year. It's pretty nuts. So yeah, I try not to let that ever wear off. And if I do, it'll be time to go do something else.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Now you talked about your, your daughter learning about George Brett. And it was funny. when you and I were in Arizona together, I had a similar experience with my wife, who also was not a big baseball fan. I grew up in Boston, right? And so we had Don Baylor, who was our hitting coach, who's I miss him. I still miss him. He was an incredible person. But Sarah just happened to get to know his wife Becky, and they just became friends, and they would watch games together. And she was just Becky, right? She didn't know anything. Yep. And we had a game in Anaheim, and we got off the elevator, and they have the old baseball cards, that are 6 feet tall or whatever, as art installed throughout the stadium. And we get off the elevator, and there's a big picture of Groove just staring at us. And Sarah just goes, "Oh, Don played?" And I'm like, "Yeah, he was a pretty big deal. I grew up in Boston. He's just like big, mean man up there swinging the bat." I'm like, "Yeah, he was pretty." "Oh, I didn't know that." And it's like, it was a great, like, just reality check, for someone like you and myself, who, like, you just, for so long you live and breathe it, and you love it, and become sort of who you are. That you're like, okay, like, get over yourself, right? Like, it's not that big a deal. He's just Becky's husband in her mind. He's just a nice guy.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, it happens all the time, because my wife is not a big fan either, and so quite often we'll be sitting at dinner in a group, and there's Hall of Famers at the table, and she'll come home, and I'll have to help her understand who that person was and why they mattered into the world of baseball. And she'll be like, "Oh, he was a really nice guy. I really enjoyed talking to him and his wife." Like, that is, I think that it's funny. There early on, probably somewhere in my 20s, when someone really got me to realize that ball players are humans, and they have all the same problems we have, and all the same maybe that's when you flip the switch from, like, okay, I'm totally starstruck talking to Eric Karros, to, like, Eric Karros is a dude. I need to get him to do this thing I need him to do. Yeah. And that's it. Let's be human together. So
yep. Yeah. And that's something I always tried to embrace in the front office, was just trying to. I feel like it's gotten, I don't know if worse is the right word, but it's gotten a little bit more challenging. I was fortunate enough to have KT as a boss and a mentor, right? Who was the ultimate clubhouse players executive, like, just had this incredible way where he could walk in the clubhouse and belong and relate to players, but just relate to people, right? That was a huge strength of his as a human. So I always got to just observe that and watch it. But I feel like, particularly the younger generation of executives that maybe didn't play or aren't as comfortable in that environment, it just became way more difficult to relate to players. And just to your point, like, they're human beings. They're husbands and sons and fathers and brothers. And it's like, they got real stuff going on in their life. And just be able to talk to them like that and say, whether it's about a contract or about their performance, or it's about their family or whatever. Again, you're in a weird way, you're coworkers, right? You're colleagues, and you're trying to help them. They're trying to help you. And it's probably hard for a lot of people to understand that, who haven't worked in the game or been close to it. But it's a unique dynamic when you kind of zoom out, and you're like, it's hard to appreciate in the moment.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually, hearing you say that, I remembered probably almost 10 years ago now, I was watching an All-Star game, and they were interviewing Derek Jeter at shortstop. This was like in the early days of talking to guys while they're actually playing. Now it's more common, but it's the first time I had ever seen it. Like, in the third inning, we're going to talk to Derek Jeter while he plays. Like, that's crazy. And I remember they asked him, as he's standing out there, like, what makes you such a good leader? How are you such a good leader? And he said, I think to lead people, you have to get to know them. And it was such a, like, simple thing, but it stuck with me. I'm like, man, he has to get to know what these people around him do, what their family's like, what their challenges are, what makes them tick. And I think, I don't know, we all pick up little leadership things over the course of our careers, but I remember that moment being like, this guy's seen as one of the best leaders that there is. And he's probably, or people used to talk about Eduardo Escobar, who are easily a top 5 guy I've ever worked with. And he would come into the clubhouse every single day and make his way around and say hello to every single person when he came in every day. And it seems like such a simple thing, but I try to do it when I come in the morning. Our office is here. There's, in this particular area, like 8 offices. I try to pop in and, hey, how you doing today? How you doing today? And it's such a simple thing, but you learn something, you find something out that someone's got going on, and it helps you interact with them and understand them.
Yeah, that's what, honestly, as I've gotten further away from sports and working in it every day, like, it's kind of what keeps me tethered to it in my sort of my heart, my mind, is that there's all these sort of very linear, very tangible lessons that, even if you're not a sports fan, you can learn from, that you can take, and they're all very, very simple, right? Like, all the leadership, lessons that you may learn from Derek Jeter or Eduardo Escobar. Just you have to know the human beings. Like it's like leadership 101, and it's like if you're running GE or you're running a taco truck or whatever, like you gotta lead. And in a weird way, it's become more challenging because you can sit there at your desk, to your point, and be like, well, I mean, look, I liked her Instagram post. Like, what more does she want? That's like the world we live in now. Like that interface isn't as regular as it was.
Yeah. And I know that certainly, I mean, we're challenged now with so many people, just like everybody, that want to work remotely. And we don't have a remote work policy here. And we've got people who have said, I really think we need to do that, especially you're living in Cooperstown. And I'm sure we could go and get people all over the country to work for the Hall of Fame if they didn't have to relocate. But there is something to being in an office every day and spending time with people and getting to know them and accidentally stumbling upon a conversation, and all of that has incredible value. And I think the world is trying to figure out right now, how do we combine these two things? Because we can't go all the way over here and we can't go all the way over there. We got to somewhere meet in the middle, and we're trying to figure it out. But very little can replace human interaction.
Yeah, I'm conflicted about it as well. I mean, just the freedom and candidly, like the productivity sometimes of working remotely is better. But you do. I'm a culture nerd, so that beehive mentality, that energy, the ability, your point of like walking into folks' office, like you're gonna, even if it's just, hey, how was your weekend? You're gonna eventually get some sort of work done, whether it's directly or indirectly, And so I'm curious, like, what have you taken, whether it's intentionally or just sort of organically from just the environment that you're in now, as a leader, as a leader of an organization, what do you try to impart on your staff when you're either the staff you inherited or as you're going to try to build that team? Like, what are some of the things that you try to lean on?
Well, it's interesting. I became a little bit of a culture nerd during our time in the D-backs because Derek talked so much about it, and it was such a thing that I don't think at the Dodgers coming up, it was really not talked about very often. In my earliest days when the O'Malley family owned the Dodgers, there was a culture, and people didn't use that term, but then we went through 4 different ownership groups and all sorts of chaos. So I saw what chaos was like, and then got to Arizona where there was much more stability for a long period of time. Certainly on the business side, maybe not as much on the baseball side.
Yeah, speak for yourself, Josh.
Yeah, exactly. As it was coming out, I was like, but ultimately, I think what I've tried to do is come in and talk about and creating an intentional culture. And I think coming out of COVID and coming off of a couple of different leadership changes here, where there were multiple presidents in the last 3 to 4 years before I got here, it's really focusing on the people. We actually instituted actual annual reviews, which we hadn't done here for a very long time, and strategic plans and things that I think give people a feeling of how does what I do connect back to the bigger picture of our mission. Because most people don't really realize that we are not a part of Major League Baseball. I mean, we're an independent nonprofit that has all of our own goals and initiatives. We have to raise our own money and all these, and so like giving people an idea. Okay, here's our mission. It's preserving history, and it's honoring excellence, and it's connecting generations. And how does each of the things that you do, you might be the 15-year-old working in the store downstairs in the museum, but how can what you're doing help us preserve history? And so I think that's what I've tried to do, is be very, very intentional about the culture that we're creating. And I think the leadership team that is currently in place, I'd say it's half and half, people who were here when I got here and people who have come on since. And they're all on board, and they all get it, and they're doing what they can to help keep that culture growing in each of their departments. And I think it is hard when you're coming. It's huge change, obviously, from a personal standpoint, to pick up your whole life and move across the country and do all those things differently that my family and I have done. But then you recognize, if you worked here at the Hall, you've gone through some tough times the last few years, and how do we bounce back from that and get attendance back to where it needs to be, and donors back to where they need to be, and membership back to where they need to be. That's it's not an easy task, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I'm curious because you've run you've led departments at teams, and so there's always that dynamic of, generally speaking, people want to work in pro sports. Most of them don't do it to get rich, right? They're doing it because they're passionate about it, they love it, whether it's that particular sport or just being in a sports environment or whatever it might be. There's a sort of a intrinsic draw of working in sports, right? And so you have sort of the entry qualifications of anybody that's there, but sometimes it can be hard to have that connective tissue between all the different departments and understand how it all fits together. But at the end of the day, if the team's performing well, if you're selling tickets, if you're getting fan engagement, whatever it might be, it's a little bit easier to connect those dots, I think. What's it been like? Has it been different from a team perspective to now? To your point, it's a nonprofit, it's a museum, it's different. What's that been like?
Yeah, it's a very unique challenge. The biggest difference, the biggest thing I miss is the rush of the ball game at the end of the night and the feeling. I mean, it was always crazy to me that for 27 years, like the office environment was impacted on something that I have no control over. You come in, you're on a 3-game losing streak, and everybody's got their dauber down, or you came off a big walk-off win, and people come in the next day, and it's like we had nothing to do with this, and yet the whole. So I definitely miss that, but I think that from the similar, I guess, approach here is that you do have where on teams you have kind of the baseball and the business side that are often hard to connect those dots. In any nonprofit, I've come to learn you have kind of the mission side and the business side. And so here it's Museum Affairs, the team of people whose job it is, they've got master's degrees, they went to school to study preservation of artifacts or archives or putting together an exhibit or writing labels that are going to go next to an artifact in a case. That's a very different group of people than someone who's selling merchandise or sponsorships or doing PR. And so I think what we've tried to do is figure out how to get all these groups not only working together more, which I think we're being moderately successful, and over time I think we'll keep getting better at, but also physically together. I mean, you probably remember at the Diamondbacks that the sales team is in center field. They're literally disconnected from everybody by 100 yards. Like it just, and so forcing yourself to walk out there and be like, okay, I'm going to go spend the next 45 minutes wandering the center field. So I just didn't do it as often as I should have. And here we have the same sort of, it's an 85-year-old building, like it's disconnected. And so you've got people here and people. So we did do some kind of reconfiguring of offices so that departments were actually all going to be together and spending more time together. We're trying to do some of those things that will help foster. Okay, we've moved a conference room to another part of the building, so people will have to actually get up and walk over and have a meeting over there. And that it's little things that hopefully over time will make a big difference.
Yeah. There's that again, it's like the human element piece of it that you kind of have to force yourself these days to do it. Mm-hmm. I talked to Andrew Miller with the Vikings the other day, and he said when he was in Cleveland, he had a calendar reminder on his phone to like get up and go walk the third floor or whatever it was, just because it's like you get lost in what you're doing, and we're all guilty of it. And if you got 20 people that are doing that, that's not exactly a team. If you work like a full week and you see each other like on your way in or on your way out, it's a little different.
Yeah, no doubt.
Has anything surprised you? Just from maybe its expectations versus reality or things that you've experienced. Has anything just been like really eye-opening to you?
Yeah, I mean, certainly understanding a lot of things about a museum are very different than anything I could have imagined. And I think I've picked up a ton in 20 months here. I'm definitely learning a lot, but I'm far from an expert in that world. So I'm just understanding how it works when you have Babe Ruth's bat. You can't just trot it around the museum every day and be like, hey, check this out. Like, it would be amazing. People would leave here with a much better experience if we just had visitor services walk around and let everybody hold the bat and see how. Yeah. And obviously it's not going to look like that 100 years from now if we do that. So things like that, certainly I've learned a ton. And then I think the thing that I said for a long time when I first got here, and maybe it's not as surprising anymore because I've seen it happen so many times, but you've got this town of 1,600, 1,800 people and an office of basically 90 full-time and another maybe 50 to 100 part-time staff. So it's about 200 people. And these events where you've got 30, 40, 50,000 people come to town and you're putting on a massive event. And so everybody's got to do a job that has nothing to do with what they got hired to do. And I like to point to our librarian who runs transportation for us, or there's a woman in the mailroom who does hospitality at the hotel. Everybody's got to do something else. And somehow it just, over decades of doing this, everybody knows their parts. It comes together. It's hard work. I don't want to minimize the amount of time and effort people put into it, but it has surprised me to see all these people just kind of, and even the town, like it kind of cracks me up. Like the guy who wrote the loan on my house helps put on our golf tournament. Like people volunteer. You look around, like I get the ridiculous honor of sitting on stage with these Hall of Famers on induction weekend. And you look out at the crowd and you're like, there are volunteers everywhere just help with the high school is over there selling food and people. It just everything kind of just comes together in a way that makes this town really unique. And that has definitely, I guess I assumed it happened somehow, but I didn't really know how it happened. And to see it
Yeah,
happen.
I was wondering, like, if is I imagine the town embraces it, but there, are there the folks that are like, oh, here come the tourists again,
Oh,
like,
that is a major. It's. I was told that before I got here, so that hasn't surprised me. But there is definitely a. If you look at, I mean, Cooperstown as a city or a village has no more or less of a percentage of people who love baseball than Phoenix, Arizona. So like, you have tons of people who love it, but you also have tons of people who don't. And if you don't love it, you run a business on Main Street, so you understand the impact of tourism. But if you're just working at the hospital, you're doing something, you live in town, and your town's about to get overloaded, and you can't park anywhere. Like those are real things that we
I
try
feel
to
like
have
that's a
to
tough place
live
to
with.
live if you don't like baseball, like,
No, it's there's a lot of people like that, and I don't
yeah,
begrudge them. I mean, in some cases, their
sure,
families were here before the Hall of Fame, and
right, yeah,
they're
fair enough,
fourth generation, fifth generation Cooperstonians, and so
right.
it's something we think about and we try to be very at least aware of, even if we can't necessarily fix it. We try to think of how to minimize the impact on the locals.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. You just have to assume that like everybody, loves baseball and they're
Yeah,
all chipping in. And I can't imagine like, I've been fortunate enough to be up there a couple times, just as a visitor, for some inductions, and just the size and scope of, and I wasn't, on the inner workings of it like you are now, but just under appreciating this is a small village. It is dispersed. Like, we stayed out at some house. I don't know where it was, way out in the middle of nowhere. Right. And you got to
yeah,
get the car and all, like, just a lot of logistics to coordinate. And that's not for the parade and for the actual Hall of Famers and for all the stuff that people are actually focused on. So it's got to be a
yeah.
big endeavor for your team.
Yeah, it is, but I think it's a in a way it's like if you're at a team, if you're at a big league team and you're putting on an all-star game or you're in the postseason, there's a pride factor when you get to the end of it that's like,
Yeah.
man, we did this. This is really cool. And I think when you hear the Hall of Famers stand up there and they're often thanking the staff for helping them get through this. I mean, it's a pretty daunting thing for Scott Rowland and Fred McGriff to go through, and I know that when they're done with this, they're going to be like, man, that group came together to make this great for us. And it's literally everything that goes that we want them to leave having had the most incredible time of their life. And same goes for the other living Hall of Famers who come back. There's 40 to 50 to 60 of those guys that are going to come back every year. We want them to have an amazing time. We want the fans who are just out in the field. I mean, we think about it. We host this, our single biggest event. We don't charge for it. People can just show up with their blanket and their lawn
Yeah. It's
chair, and they
great,
just get
man.
to take it all in. And
Yeah.
it's such a cool, old school, amazing way to operate, that it works. It just works.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to probably learn from just that, right? Just that experience as far as like some of the stuff we've already touched on. But speaking of Freddie, has he stopped smiling yet?
No, he man, that guy. I'm sure you've probably gotten to know him. He is. I used to joke in '03 we had him at the Dodgers, and it was not his best year, but he was always a pro, and I would go and ask him to do stuff, and I just remember I'd go, "Hey Fred, you got a minute?" And he'd give me this, and then he'd break into this giant
That big
grin.
smile.
Just messing
Yeah.
with me. He just has the biggest smile, and he is very, very excited to be a part of this. And I think he waited a long time. There's a lot of people that felt like
Yep.
that 490 some odd home runs, he probably would have
Right.
gotten in if he just had 8 more.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but yeah, and ultimately he was unanimous on the era committee ballot, and I thought that was pretty exciting for him. And I know he's gonna have a blast this summer.
Yeah. Yeah. I can just I've seen it in person. I've seen it like on TV since he's been inducted, and I just I can see it in my mind's eye, the look on his face, and he'll just be soaking it in. I was lucky enough to work with Fred in Atlanta, and we would again talk about humility and somebody that just appreciates sort of where they are in life. He was sitting in our draft room. He would go look at players. He was just one of, there was no special treatment. He was just one of the guys, and we almost had to coax him. You've been around players that they, hey, I played 10 years in the big leagues. Like, let me
Yeah,
teach you guys how it's done. Right. And
yeah,
we almost had to pull it out of him. Like, hey, Fred, what do you think? Right. And then he'd get real inside baseball and start talking about hitting. I'm like, okay, everybody listen. Right.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
but he loved it. He was part of it. He had his guys that he liked. He had his guys that he didn't like, and he was willing to
yeah.
voice those opinions in the right way. And,
That's awesome.
but it was just, I always appreciated the fact that he was just willing he was just going to sit in the room and be part of it and not like kind of come in for 30 minutes and, shake hands and kiss babies and then leave. He was engaged.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think he'll be that way with this group when he gets in. There's like a kind of first year overwhelmedness of what it is that you're walking into.
Yeah.
And we tell the inductees, like, this first year is going to be nuts. But then after that, you're going to absolutely love just being one of the guys hanging out on the veranda. You don't have literally nothing to do but just
No responsibilities. Yeah.
And
yeah.
I think that's when it really starts to get good. That's David Ortiz will get that for the first time this year. Derek Jeter actually didn't make it back for last year's. He had somebody get sick in the family, so he hasn't been back since induction. And so you bring back any of these guys that really kind of feel it for the first time. It's a totally different environment, and then they can just soak it all in.
Yeah. Well, I know Fred will be a great ambassador for the Hall of Fame and in that group, and he'll embrace that. He's always done that throughout his career, from what I've learned, that he's been a great veteran, right? And that's like, even like you talked about the cool Johnny Bench story, like to see that same dynamic that you see in a big league clubhouse when they bring up a group of rookies and somebody inevitably puts their arm around them and says, all right, boys, like this is how we do it. Like, I'm going to buy you your first suit for your road trip and this and that. Exactly. And like, kind of pay it forward. It's cool to know that is going on, sort of in a living history museum.
Yeah. And it's been going on for decades, where the guys that Ted Williams would do it to those guys, and then whoever, Bruce Sutter, would do it for his guy. I mean, everybody's just, every single guy, I think they recognize what this means. And there's just almost I can't believe I'm here mentality. I better find a way to pay it forward. That's pretty amazing.
It is amazing. And I think it's a great lesson for all of us, right? Just kind of appreciate where you are in life and be able to just be present. I mean, those guys you can see it even when you watch it on TV. They're just kind of, particularly the guys, the guys that have been there for 20 years, it's a little bit old hat, but the guys that are newer, you can just see it's still just kind of like washing over them. And it's cool to see guys that have done incredible things and are the best, not just the best in the world, but best in the history of the world at what they do at their chosen profession, to be that sort of humble and gracious and just like kids, they're meeting Johnny Bench or they're meeting Hank Aaron. And it's like, oh my, like, it's just, It's cool. It's like the Ted Williams moment in Boston years ago, right? During the All-Star game.
Well, like, it's funny you mentioned it. Literally sitting right next to me. It's the cover of our new Memories and Dreams.
Oh, amazing.
It literally, I was just looking at it this morning, came in yesterday, and it's the Ted Williams moment. And it's Griffey and Ripken and Marichal just kind of like blown away by what's happening to them. And now it's people that are doing that with Griffey and Ripken. It's just, it's a pretty special place. And what's cool is that it does, I mean, they're ultimately the goal of this place is to preserve the history. I mean, this is America's pastime. And so when you think about, there are guys who are on the plaque gallery that many people don't know. They played in the 1800s or early 1900s, or maybe even they played in the 1960s, but the 12-year-olds walking through here today don't know who that is. And this is preserving it. This is making it so that 50 years, 100, 200 years from now, people will be able to walk in here and not only be able to see that, but walk through the museum and learn about it. And then ultimately, I mean, when we tell them, when people donate artifacts here, I'm having a conversation right now about our Big Black Baseball exhibit that we've got coming up. And so I've been talking to the family of Kurt Flood and Don Newcomb and Campanella. And it's like, when we take in an artifact, we are promising to look after it forever. And that is a long time to look after something. But we want to make sure that your great, great, great grandkids can come back in and be like, hey, I've got a note on my desk from my call a couple days ago with Home Run Baker's grandson, who was like, got some stuff of his I've been thinking about sending to the Hall. And so I said, hey, if you want your great grandkids to be able to come and show up and be like, hey, great, 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 great Grandpa Baker we'll break that out for them 100 years from now and let them hold the bat and let them see this thing up close. And that's ultimately, I mean, we never buy any artifacts. Everything that we have is donated because people recognize that we're preserving it for all of time. And that's it's pretty special.
Yeah, it's a pretty big obligation.
Yeah, it's it's a pretty big honor. I mean, it is. There's no
for sure. Yeah, it's a big responsibility.
It is. Yeah, I think everybody here recognizes it. And even it's funny. I mean, I'm sure you remember that there were people at the teams who didn't necessarily love baseball. Somebody who might be that kind of surprises people to learn that. But there are people here that are from the local area and they got a job at the Hall 15 years ago, and they might not be the biggest baseball fan ever, but they recognize what this place means and they recognize its special spot in American history. And so pretty amazing.
Yeah, yeah, it is, and the history thread there is. I'm grateful that it's happening in baseball. I feel like there's been this movement to, in some ways, like erase history, and I just feel like we're doing ourselves a disservice if you do that. It's there's so much to learn, good or bad, from things that have happened in the past, and um, we took our kids to DC last summer, and we're walking through the Smithsonian, and just there's a little baseball exhibit, and there was a picture of Hank Aaron, and it's got the jersey you think of when you think of Hank Aaron, right? Like the old
Yeah,
school
yeah,
Braves jersey.
yep.
And I've actually got a framed autographed Hank Aaron jersey
I
from my
love it.
time in Atlanta, and it's in my son's room. And he's like, "Hey, he has no idea, like no clue." And
Right.
he's like,
Yeah.
"That's just a shirt." And my
Yeah.
wife and my daughter was just like, when you're a kid that age, anybody who's famous is just like, it's cool to know, like, to have some connection. I'm like, I don't
Yeah.
think you guys really appreciate how famous Hank Aaron was,
Probably not.
but it's just like that thread of history that I never saw him play. They've never seen him play, but they'll appreciate kind of what that means, and that's whether it's baseball or life, right? Just have that appreciation for what came before you, and
Yeah.
learn from that, and maybe
Yeah.
avoid some of the same pitfalls.
Yeah, and that's, I think, very significant in what you just said from our standpoint, is that we don't try to hide the truth, and we don't try to rewrite history. And so there's certainly been people who have said, like, would you take down someone's plaque if you learned something about them? And our we have a note outside the plaque gallery that specifically says this is a plaque gallery based on what information was available at the time that they were elected, but we're not going to take down people's plaques and take down history. What we will do is try to put it into context elsewhere in the museum. And so
Sure.
if it's someone who turned out to be racist, we'll find a way to mention that somewhere else in the museum, so that we don't avoid that. And frankly, this Black Baseball initiative that we're undertaking, that'll really open up in April as an exhibit here, but as a pretty massive institution-wide initiative, we are committed to telling all the stories, good, bad, ugly, that have happened in baseball. And it is, again, a big responsibility. We want to do it right, um, because if we're just glossing over whether it's the challenges that happened in the earliest days, to what happened when the Negro League started falling apart, to what still happens today and the decline in participation among Black players, like, all those things are part of the story. That's our job. Our job is to preserve that history, tell it, and then hopefully inspire people to keep coming back and be a part of it.
Yeah, man. Well, look, I think it's an important job, and I think sports mimic life in a lot of ways, and baseball has, especially in this country, has sort of tracked or with our culture and our society. And so what happens sort of in baseball is being reflected across the rest of our society. So if we're ignoring one, we're kind of ignoring the other. So I think it's a good point to make, and it's, again, a big responsibility, but it's an important one, and I know you're embracing it.
Yeah, loving it. And it's funny. Most people don't even realize. We were just talking about this recently, that you talk about American society and baseball, like the Star Spangled Banner was played at the World Series in 1918 for the first time, kind of just randomly, and the next thing you know, it's played at every World Series game forevermore, and it becomes our national anthem. And think about 9/11 and George Bush throwing the first pitch and what that
Yeah,
meant, and all these
yeah,
incredible moments where baseball was there for the country when it needed. And we actually have in our collection this green light letter from President Roosevelt saying, even though World War II is going on, I think you guys should still be playing baseball. It's right for the country to be doing, so people can continue to take their mind. And you just look and you go, man, that's in our collection. That's crazy.
yeah.
But it still happens all the time now. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's got a unique place in our history. It's different from other sports, and I think that baseball does as good a job, if not better, of leaning in on that history and telling those stories. And even if somebody that follows you, you kind of, I mean, I'm sure you've learned a ton just in your time there, like
Every
all
day.
these
Yeah.
little, like, rabbit holes you go down that you're like, oh, presidents and dignitaries and wars and all these like historical events. You're like, there's a
Yeah.
baseball tie in there.
Yep. Always. It
Yeah.
feels like it's always been there, and it always will be there. And that's why, like, people talk about, I mean, baseball may be quote unquote losing popularity because there are all these other options. 50, 60 years ago, there weren't a million different options, but on a nightly basis, it's still, even in Arizona where the newest team exists, it's still the number one most watched program all summer long is Diamondbacks baseball. And that's the case in, I don't know, 27 of the cities across the country. And it is such a huge part of who we are. I don't want to be naive to the challenges that we have of making sure the kids keep playing it. And that's part of what we're trying to do here in the museum. We actually just added a cool interactive where kids can make their own plaque. We want to make it
Cool.
relevant for the next generation
Yeah.
of fans that come through. and they're going to experience it different than the people that came before them. But can't ignore that. We got to find ways to keep making it what everybody loves. So 50 years from now, some other guys doing a podcast with some other president in the Hall of Fame, and they're enjoying it.
Yeah, but look, I mean, I'm a big advocate of kids playing multiple sports, you know, and there are lots of lessons to glean from baseball, whether it's as an athlete, as a coach, as a fan of the game, as you know, you name it. Like you just have so much history to draw on. Again, that like, yeah, I know there's more options. That parallel society now, and there's just more distraction, you know. But like, if you're gonna get into tennis or golf or basketball or whatever, like look to, I mean, competing in sports and performance is all sort of the same game. And so you can lean on these lessons for baseball that is, again, being preserved, you know, right behind you. And it's incredible. I hope people take the advantage of looking at it, even if they're not, you know, rabid baseball fans. I think there's a lot you can kind of pull out of just sort of walking those halls and you know, reading some things.
Yeah, there is, and I appreciate you saying that because it's an amazing place to visit. Even if you don't love the game, there's so much to see and do in Cooperstown, from golf to the other museums to the lake that's literally, I don't know, 20 feet that way. I mean, just an amazing place to come see. And I keep telling people, take it off your bucket list, get it on your to-do list, and get out here and come see what we got going on.
Yeah, man, for sure. We'll have to get up there at some point soon. Bring the kids, experience it. So,
you guys, anytime.
Yeah, man. Well, Josh, I appreciate you taking the time, and it's been a ton of fun. It's good to know that you are the custodian over, you know, the history of the game. It's a big responsibility, but I can't think of anybody better for it.
Well, thanks, buddy. I appreciate it, and look forward to staying in touch here. Hopefully, getting you up here soon and seeing the fam.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the No One Is Watching podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to hit subscribe to be notified of future episodes. If you'd like to support the show, please take a second, leave a rating and review, or share it with your friends. If you're interested in similar content, you can check out my website at nooneiswatching.com, where you can subscribe to the newsletter, read my blog, or follow me on your social media platform of choice. Look, your time is valuable, so thank you for lending me some of it. We'll see you next time.